Welcome to Sleepy Life Errors. Tonight, we are spending a peaceful night inside a medieval monastery. Nothing here needs your attention. Everything moves slowly. You are safe to rest. You are safe to listen. This environment is designed to play quietly in the background while you sleep. The evening has already begun. The interior space belongs to a medieval monastery, enclosed by thick stone walls that hold the temperature of the night. This quiet room sits deep within the monastery grounds, finished with the day and settled into stillness. Nothing inside this space waits to be done. A single candle rests within the room, its flame steady and contained. The candlelight remains warm and limited, touching only nearby surfaces. Beyond the candle's reach, the room stays in shadow. The shadows are deep and unbroken. The stone walls show uneven texture, worn smooth in some places and rough in others. Their color remains muted and softened by age and low light. The ceiling stays low and unobtrusive, disappearing into darkness above. Simple wooden furnishings remain where they belong. A table stands close to the wall. A bench rests beneath it. No objects suggest activity or movement. Everything appears settled and unchanged. The stone floor is cool and bare. It reflects no light beyond a faint, dull sheen near the candle. Corners remain dim and indistinct. There is a single narrow opening in the wall. The opening shows only darkness beyond. No exterior light enters the room. No sound arrives from outside. The monastery grounds remain silent. The air inside the room feels heavy and still. Nothing disturbs it. The space does not echo. Sound, if present at all, fades quickly into the stone. This room exists as it is, without variation. It does not signal beginnings or endings. It holds no sense of sequence. The interior remains constant. The light remains singular. The silence remains complete. This is a finished place, enclosed and unchanging, held quietly within the night. The stone room within the monastery remains enclosed. Thick stone walls continue to hold the night. The space remains finished with the day. Nothing in the room signals activity or purpose. A single candle remains present within the interior. The candle exists as the only source of light. The light remains limited and contained. Shadow remains beyond the edge of the light. Darkness holds its place without interruption. The walls remain stone and unchanged. Their surfaces remain uneven and worn. The ceiling remains above, mostly unseen. The floor remains stone and bare. No objects shift position within the space. No marks suggest recent use or attention. The room remains quiet within the monastery. Silence remains present without emphasis. The candlelight touches only what is near. Everything beyond remains indistinct. Nothing changes within the space. The room remains the same. Stone remains stone. Light remains light. Shadow remains shadow. The interior remains settled and complete. The room does not suggest sequence. It does not suggest duration. It does not suggest transition. The candle remains a quiet point of light. The light does not extend far. Darkness remains complete beyond it. The room stays enclosed by stone. The monastery remains quiet beyond the walls. No exterior sound enters the room. No exterior light appears inside. The narrow opening remains dark. Darkness remains beyond the opening. The air inside the room stays still. The space holds sound without echo. Any sound present fades without consequence. Nothing accumulates within the room. Nothing resolves or concludes. The room remains present without emphasis. Stone walls remain in place. The light remains singular and steady. Shadow remains consistent across the room. The interior remains unchanged. The arrangement of the space remains simple. Objects remain where they are placed. Surfaces remain visible only near the light. Edges remain soft and indistinct. The room continues without variation. The candle remains present. The light remains steady. The darkness remains uninterrupted. The walls remain surrounding. The ceiling remains above. The floor remains below. The space remains enclosed and contained. The monastery remains quiet and still. Silence remains consistent within the space. No signal interrupts the stillness. No detail draws attention. The room remains complete as it is. Nothing suggests change or difference. Nothing suggests movement or action. Nothing suggests time passing. The light continues to exist. The shadows continue to exist. The space continues to exist. The room remains what it is. The interior remains constant and quiet. The candle remains the only light. Darkness remains beyond the light. The walls remain close and steady. The room remains contained within stone. Nothing begins within the space. Nothing ends within the space. Nothing waits to occur. The interior remains settled within the monastery. The night remains held by stone and shadow. The room remains unchanged. The candle remains in place within the room. Its flame exists as a small and steady source of light. The light stays close to the candle. The space beyond the light remains dark. The candle continues to provide the only illumination. Nothing competes with its presence. The light does not travel far across the stone. Shadow holds the rest of the room. The candle remains unchanged. The light remains unchanged. The darkness remains unchanged. The flame is small and contained. Its brightness stays modest. The glow rests near its source. Stone closest to the candle stays visible. Stone farther away remains indistinct. The contrast between light and shadow remains stable. Nothing alters that balance. The candle remains present. The flame remains present. The light remains present. Shadow continues to surround it. The candle does not draw attention outward. The light does not suggest movement. The glow stays settled where it is. Darkness stays settled where it is. The candle exists without change. The flame exists without emphasis. The light exists without variation. The surrounding shadow exists without interruption. The candle remains the central point of brightness. No other light appears. No reflection expands the glow. The candlelight remains contained. The edges of the light remain soft. There is no sharp boundary. Light fades gently into darkness. Darkness accepts the fading without change. The candle remains still. The flame remains steady. The light remains calm. The shadows remain calm. The candle does not suggest activity. The flame does not suggest urgency. The light does not suggest sequence. Shadow does not suggest depth beyond itself. The candle continues to occupy its place. The glow continues to occupy a small area. The darkness continues to occupy the rest. Nothing changes the relationship between them. Light remains near. Darkness remains far. The candle remains the same size. The flame remains the same shape. The glow remains the same strength. The shadows remain the same depth. The candle stays where it is. The light stays where it is. The darkness stays where it is. The candle provides no signal. The flame provides no message. The light provides no instruction. The shadow provides no response. The candle remains quiet. The flame remains quiet. The light remains quiet. The darkness remains quiet. The candle exists as a simple presence. The flame exists as a steady presence. The light exists as a limited presence. The shadow exists as a complete presence. The candle remains unchanged within the room. The light remains unchanged within the space. The darkness remains unchanged around it. The balance between them remains constant. The candle does not lead anywhere. The light does not invite attention beyond itself. The shadow does not conceal anything new. Everything remains as it is. The candle remains visible. The flame remains visible. The light remains visible. The darkness remains dominant. The candle remains small. The room remains mostly dark. The candle does not grow brighter. The darkness does not recede. The light remains modest and contained. The shadow remains wide and uninterrupted. The candle continues to exist without change. The flame continues to exist without change. The light continues to exist without change. The darkness continues to exist without change. Nothing alters the candle. Nothing alters the flame. Nothing alters the light. Nothing alters the shadow. The candle remains present in the same way. The light remains present in the same way. The darkness remains present in the same way. The candle does not indicate time. The light does not indicate progress. The shadow does not indicate change. The candle remains a fixed point. The light remains a fixed presence. The darkness remains a fixed field. The relationship between them remains stable. The candle remains. The light remains. The darkness remains. Nothing else is required. The stone walls remain in place around the room. The stone holds its shape without change. The surface of the walls stays uneven and worn. No section of stone draws attention over another. The walls remain close and enclosing. Their texture stays visible only where light reaches. Beyond that, the stone fades into shadow. The stone does not reflect much light. It absorbs most of what touches it. The walls remain quiet and still. No markings suggest recent use. No marks suggest change. The stone floor remains beneath the room. Its surface stays flat and solid. The floor remains bare. It shows no movement or disturbance. The stone floor reflects very little light. Only a faint dull sheen appears near the light. Beyond that, the floor remains dark. The stone walls remain vertical and steady. They do not shift or settle. They remain exactly where they are. The floor remains level and unchanged. Nothing rests on it that alters its surface. Nothing disturbs its stillness. The stone walls and the stone floor remain separate but connected. They meet at clear edges. Those edges remain visible only near the light. In shadow, the edges soften. The stone remains consistent in color. Muted tones remain present across the surfaces. No area appears brighter than another for long. The walls remain cool and solid. The floor remains cool and solid. The stone holds the space without movement. Nothing within the stone suggests activity. Nothing within the stone suggests time passing. The walls do not signal beginning or end. The floor does not signal direction. Stone remains stone. Surface remains surface. Texture remains texture. The walls remain unchanged. The floor remains unchanged. The stone remains settled within the room. The room remains held by stone. The stone does not shift position. It does not respond to attention. It does not invite interaction. The walls remain enclosing without pressure. The floor remains supporting without emphasis. The stone continues to exist as it is. Light touches the stone briefly and stays close. Shadow covers the rest of the surface. The balance between light and stone remains stable. The balance between shadow and stone remains stable. No surface becomes more important than another. No detail rises forward. The stone remains uniform in presence. The walls remain steady and fixed. The floor remains steady and fixed. The stone absorbs sound without echo. Any sound present fades quickly against it. The stone remains quiet. The stone remains still. The stone remains unchanged. The room continues to be defined by stone surfaces. Those surfaces remain familiar and unaltered. Nothing draws focus away from them. Nothing adds detail to them. The stone walls remain close. The stone floor remains below. The stone continues to hold the space. The room remains grounded by stone. The surfaces remain exactly as they are. No change appears across them. The stone remains present in the same way. The stone remains present in the same way. The stone remains present in the same way. The walls remain stone. The floor remains stone. The room remains stone-held and quiet. The wooden table remains where it is within the room. The surface of the table stays flat and plain. The wood shows no sign of recent use. Its grain remains visible only near the light. Beyond the light, the surface fades into shadow. The table remains quiet and still. Nothing rests upon it that suggests activity. The edges of the table remain straight and familiar. No part of the surface draws attention over another. The table remains simple in form. Its shape remains unchanged. The wood retains a muted tone under the candlelight. The light touches the table gently and does not spread far. The table remains present without emphasis. The bench remains positioned near the table. Its wooden surface stays smooth and worn. The bench remains empty and undisturbed. No marks suggest recent movement. The bench remains exactly where it is. Its legs rest firmly on the stone floor. The wood of the bench holds its shape without variation. Light reaches the bench only in a small area. The rest of the bench remains in shadow. The table and bench remain paired without purpose. They exist together without interaction. The wood remains quiet within the room. No sound comes from the surfaces. Any sound present fades against the wood and stone. The table remains unchanged. The bench remains unchanged. The grain of the wood remains subtle and subdued. Its texture appears only where the light allows. The candlelight does not highlight detail for long. The wood absorbs most of the light that touches it. The table remains solid and still. The bench remains solid and still. Neither suggests movement or use. Neither suggests sequence or time. The table does not indicate beginning or end. The bench does not indicate direction or purpose. The wood remains present without invitation. Its surfaces do not call for attention. The table exists as it is. The bench exists as it is. Their placement within the room remains familiar. Nothing about them appears temporary. Nothing about them appears new. The table remains close to the wall. The bench remains close to the table. The distance between them remains the same. The wood shows no shine beyond a dull softness. Light rests briefly along the edges. Shadow holds the rest of the surfaces. The table remains level. The bench remains level. Nothing tilts or shifts. Nothing settles further. The table remains quiet in the candlelight. The bench remains quiet in the candlelight. The wood does not reflect sound. It absorbs sound without response. The table remains simple. The bench remains simple. No decoration alters their appearance. No object rests upon their surfaces. The wood remains uninterrupted. The surfaces remain clear and bare. The candlelight does not linger. It touches and passes without change. The table remains a stable presence. The bench remains a stable presence. Their forms remain consistent. Their edges remain familiar. The wood does not suggest activity. It does not suggest waiting. It does not suggest use. The table remains finished with the day. The bench remains finished with the day. The wood remains settled within the room. No change appears across the surfaces. No variation appears in their form. The table remains present without signal. The bench remains present without signal. The wood remains neutral and quiet. Light continues to touch only what is near. Shadow continues to hold the rest. The table remains as it was. The bench remains as it was. Nothing about them invites focus. Nothing about them suggests change. The wood remains unchanged within the space. The table and bench remain exactly where they are. The room continues to hold them quietly. The surfaces remain calm and unmarked. The wood remains still. The wood remains still. The table remains present. The bench remains present. Nothing else is required. The air within the room remains still. The air holds its place without movement. Nothing disturbs the space it occupies. The air remains settled among the stone walls. It does not shift or circulate. It remains evenly present throughout the room. No current passes through it. No change appears within it. The air remains quiet and unremarkable. It does not carry sound far. Any sound present softens quickly. The air absorbs what reaches it. It offers no resistance and no response. The air remains consistent near the walls. It remains consistent near the floor. It remains consistent near the ceiling. No layer of air feels separate from another. The space remains evenly filled. The air does not announce itself. It does not draw attention. It remains present without emphasis. The air remains part of the room without distinction. It does not press or pull. It does not thin or gather. The air remains neutral within the space. No temperature change appears within it. No variation marks its presence. The air remains settled between surfaces. It rests among stone and wood without effect. The air remains unchanged near the candlelight. It remains unchanged in shadow. Light passes through it without alteration. Shadow remains unchanged by it. The air holds sound briefly and then releases it. No echo forms within it. No vibration lingers. The air remains quiet and complete. It does not suggest motion or pause. It does not suggest direction or depth. The air remains evenly present throughout the interior. Nothing in the room interacts with it. Nothing within it changes form. The air remains part of the finished space. It does not respond to attention. It does not invite notice. The air remains simple and unmarked. It remains as it has been. No boundary appears within it. No edge divides it. The air remains uniform from wall to wall. It remains uniform from floor to ceiling. The space remains filled without change. The air does not alter the room. The room does not alter the air. They remain together without interaction. The air holds the quiet in place. The quiet remains settled within it. No sound gathers or travels. The air allows silence to remain intact. It neither amplifies nor diminishes it. The air remains passive and unchanged. It remains without feature or emphasis. The air remains present near every surface. It remains present in every corner. No corner holds different air. No space feels separate. The air remains continuous throughout the room. It does not shift attention. It does not carry meaning. The air remains unremarkable and steady. Nothing within it signals change. Nothing within it signals time passing. The air remains constant within the monastery room. It remains enclosed by stone without effect. The air remains settled in place. No difference appears within it. No variation rises or falls. The air remains quiet among the walls. It remains quiet near the floor. It remains quiet near the ceiling. The air remains quiet everywhere within the room. It remains exactly as it is. Nothing is required of it. Nothing is offered by it. The air remains unchanged within the space. The room continues to hold it without movement. The air continues to exist without change. The air remains. The darkness beyond the opening remains complete. The opening shows only darkness. No light appears beyond it. The exterior remains unseen and undefined. The darkness holds its place outside the room. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing alters its depth. The darkness remains uniform beyond the wall. It does not suggest distance or closeness. It does not suggest direction. The opening remains quiet and still. Darkness fills it without variation. No shape emerges within it. No outline becomes visible. The darkness beyond remains unmarked. It carries no signal. It carries no detail. The boundary between interior and exterior remains clear. Inside remains enclosed. Beyond remains dark. The darkness does not press inward. It does not recede outward. It remains where it is. The opening does not frame a view. It frames only absence of light. The darkness beyond remains steady. It does not thin or gather. It does not change tone. The exterior night remains undefined. No sound arrives from beyond the opening. No movement appears within the darkness. The darkness remains passive and complete. It does not respond to attention. It does not invite inspection. The opening remains dark throughout. The darkness remains consistent across it. No contrast appears within it. No edge becomes distinct. The darkness beyond remains uninterrupted. It does not suggest weather or space. It does not suggest time. The opening remains a simple boundary. Beyond it, darkness continues. The darkness remains separate from the interior light. Light does not enter it. Darkness does not enter the room. They remain apart. The exterior remains unseen and quiet. The darkness beyond remains without feature. It does not shift or move. It does not brighten or dim. The opening remains unchanged. The darkness beyond remains unchanged. The exterior remains still and absent. No pattern forms within the darkness. No repetition appears within it. The darkness remains continuous. It extends without indication. The opening holds the boundary without change. Inside remains finished and enclosed. Beyond remains dark and undefined. The darkness does not suggest scale. It does not suggest distance. It does not suggest presence. The opening remains a quiet frame of darkness. The darkness beyond remains neutral. It does not carry meaning. It does not carry signal. The exterior remains sealed by darkness. The opening remains still. The darkness remains still. Nothing emerges from beyond. Nothing withdraws into it. The darkness remains exactly as it is. The opening remains unchanged over time. No difference appears within the darkness. No variation draws attention. The darkness beyond remains passive. It remains without emphasis. The opening continues to show only darkness. The darkness continues to show nothing else. The exterior remains absent of detail. The darkness does not reveal or conceal. It simply remains. The boundary remains intact. The interior remains separate. The darkness beyond remains present beyond the room. The opening remains a constant frame. The darkness holds within it without variation. Nothing within the opening draws focus. Nothing beyond it suggests difference. The exterior remains unseen and quiet. The boundary between inside and outside remains intact. The darkness beyond continues without signal or change. The boundaries of the room remain clearly defined. The walls meet the floor without variation. The walls meet the ceiling without emphasis. Corners remain where surfaces come together. Those corners remain quiet and unchanged. No boundary shifts or softens. The edges of the room remain fixed in place. They do not advance or recede. The room remains contained within its limits. Each surface holds its position. The walls remain upright and steady. The floor remains level and supportive. The ceiling remains above without presence. No boundary draws attention over another. All edges remain equal in importance. Corners remain dim and still. Light reaches some boundaries and leaves others untouched. Shadow fills the rest without change. The boundary between light and shadow remains stable. It does not move along the walls. The corners remain where they are. They do not deepen or fade. The edges of the floor remain straight and quiet. They do not suggest direction. They do not suggest distance. The walls remain close enough to enclose the space. They do not press inward. They do not withdraw outward. The room remains a complete enclosure. No boundary opens or closes. No surface breaks its line. The edges where stone meets stone remain consistent. No seam changes or draws focus. The room remains evenly defined on all sides. The limits of the space remain unchanged. Nothing crosses a boundary. Nothing presses against an edge. The corners remain unoccupied and still. They hold shadow without variation. The meeting points of surfaces remain quiet. No line curves or bends. No edge becomes sharper or softer. The room remains measured by its boundaries alone. Those boundaries remain familiar and constant. The floor defines the lower limit of the space. The ceiling defines the upper limit without emphasis. The walls define the sides without pressure. All limits remain balanced and still. The space between boundaries remains unchanged. Nothing expands within it. Nothing contracts within it. The room remains the same size. The boundaries do not suggest scale beyond themselves. They do not suggest movement or sequence. The edges remain simple and quiet. They do not invite inspection. The corners remain subdued and indistinct. They do not reveal detail. The boundary lines remain continuous. They do not break or pause. The enclosure remains complete on all sides. No boundary opens to another space. No edge leads elsewhere. The room remains self-contained. The limits remain exactly where they are. Nothing within the room challenges them. Nothing beyond the room affects them. The boundaries remain neutral and still. They do not signal change. They do not signal time passing. The room remains quietly defined by its edges. The boundaries remain present without emphasis. They hold the space without effort. The enclosure remains complete and settled. The corners remain unchanged. The edges remain unchanged. The limits remain unchanged. The room remains exactly as bounded as before. Nothing alters the shape of the space. Nothing alters the reach of the walls. Nothing alters the height of the ceiling. Nothing alters the span of the floor. The boundaries remain quiet and intact. The room remains enclosed without variation. The edges remain stable and familiar. The corners remain still and dim. The space remains held by its limits. The boundaries remain present without signal or change. Surfaces nearest the candle remain gently visible. The light touches only what is close. Stone nearest the flame holds a faint clarity. Beyond that, surfaces soften into shadow. The light does not travel far across the room. It remains close to its source. What lies nearest stays defined. What lies farther remains indistinct. The boundary between near and far remains stable. It does not shift along the walls. The floor closest to the light appears gently present. The floor beyond fades quietly from view. The surface of the table nearest the candle holds a muted glow. The rest of the surface remains in shadow. Edges close to the light stay visible. Edges farther away soften and disappear. The light defines only a small area. The rest of the room remains outside that definition. No surface pulls the light toward it. The light does not seek distance. It remains where it is. Stone near the candle shows subtle texture. Stone farther away shows none. The difference between near and far remains constant. It does not increase or lessen. The light does not climb the walls. It rests only at a familiar height. Surfaces close to that height remain faintly present. Surfaces beyond remain dim and undefined. The candlelight does not reveal depth beyond itself. It reveals only proximity. Nearness remains clear. Distance remains quiet. The table's edge closest to the flame stays visible. The far edge remains unseen. The bench nearest the light holds a dull outline. The rest of the bench remains absorbed by shadow. The wall closest to the candle shows muted tone. The opposite wall remains indistinct. Light favors proximity without intention. Shadow holds distance without resistance. The surfaces do not compete for light. They remain as they are. The near surfaces feel complete. The far surfaces feel absent of detail. The boundary between them remains even and quiet. No surface crosses it. No surface retreats from it. The light continues to rest close by. It does not wander. The near stone holds its familiar presence. The far stone remains undefined. The candlelight touches the floor near its base. The floor beyond that point remains dark. Surfaces close to the candle appear gently complete. Surfaces farther away appear quietly unfinished. The difference remains subtle and stable. The light does not sharpen edges at a distance. Edges near the flame stay soft. Edges farther away dissolve into shadow. The candle defines a small circle of presence. Outside that circle, surfaces lose clarity. The near space feels contained. The far space feels open and undefined. Neither space changes its character. The light does not advance. The shadow does not withdraw. They remain balanced. The table surface nearest the candle remains softly visible. The remainder stays beyond attention. The stone floor near the light holds a dull sheen. The rest remains matte and dark. The wall closest to the flame shows faint texture. The far wall shows none. Proximity remains the only distinction. Distance remains undefined. The candlelight does not favor one surface over another. It simply remains near. The surfaces accept this without change. Nearness remains gentle. Farness remains quiet. The light does not expand its reach. The shadow does not contract. The surfaces remain arranged as they are. The near surfaces remain visible enough. The far surfaces remain unseen enough. Nothing alters the balance between them. The room remains defined by proximity alone. Near and far remain unchanged. The candlelight continues to rest close to itself. The surfaces nearest remain present. The surfaces beyond remain indistinct. This distinction remains quiet and steady. Proximity continues to limit what is seen. Distance continues to soften what is not. The near surfaces hold attention without effort. The far surfaces release attention without demand. The light maintains its small reach. The shadow maintains its wide presence. Nearness and farness remain balanced. No surface shifts closer or farther. No edge moves within the light. The surfaces remain quiet under the candlelight. Nothing else is required. Surfaces nearest the light remain faintly present. The light stays close to where it begins. What lies nearby remains gently visible. What lies farther remains undefined. The distinction between near and far remains unchanged. It does not shift across the space. Near surfaces hold a quiet clarity. Far surfaces hold none. The light does not extend its reach. It remains contained within a small area. Surfaces closest remain softly outlined. Surfaces beyond remain absorbed by shadow. The difference remains stable. Nothing alters it. Nearness remains gentle. Distance remains quiet. The light defines proximity without intention. Shadow defines distance without resistance. The balance between them remains even. No surface crosses from far to near. No surface withdraws from view. The near area remains familiar. The far area remains indistinct. Edges closest remain soft and visible. Edges farther away dissolve quietly. Nothing sharpens beyond the light. Nothing clarifies at a distance. The light continues to rest close to itself. The space beyond remains outside definition. Near surfaces remain complete enough. Far surfaces remain unfinished enough. The distinction does not invite attention. It simply remains. The visible area stays limited. The unseen area stays wide. Neither expands nor contracts. Nearness does not increase. Farness does not decrease. The light does not move outward. Shadow does not move inward. They remain balanced as they are. The near surfaces show only what is necessary. They show no extra detail. The far surfaces show nothing at all. They remain quiet and undefined. The boundary between them remains subtle. It does not mark itself. It does not draw focus. Nearness remains a soft presence. Distance remains a quiet absence. The light reveals only what is close enough. It does not reach beyond that. Surfaces nearest remain faintly held. Surfaces farther away remain released. The distinction continues without effort. No surface gains importance. No surface loses importance. Near and far remain equal in stillness. The visible area remains calm. The unseen area remains calm. Nothing changes their relationship. The light does not search for distance. It remains close by. Shadow remains where the light is not. The space between them remains quiet. Near surfaces continue to accept the light. Far surfaces continue to accept darkness. Neither responds. The distinction remains gentle. It does not demand attention. It does not create contrast beyond itself. Nearness remains familiar. Distance remains unknown. Both remain unchanged. The visible area stays small. The invisible area stays large. No surface shifts closer. No surface shifts farther away. The light continues to define only proximity. It defines nothing else. Surfaces remain arranged as they are. Near remains near. Far remains far. The distinction remains steady and quiet. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing replaces it. The space remains defined by closeness alone. Distance remains without detail. The light remains modest and contained. Shadow remains wide and unbroken. Near surfaces remain visible enough. Far surfaces remain unseen enough. This balance remains unchanged. The room remains quiet within it. Nothing else is required. The room remains quiet. No sound rises within the space. Silence remains present without effort. Nothing interrupts it. No noise forms along the walls. No sound gathers near the floor. The ceiling holds no echo. The air carries nothing audible. Silence remains even and unchanged. It does not deepen or thin. No sound approaches from beyond the room. No sound withdraws into distance. The quiet remains settled throughout the space. Nothing disturbs it. The silence holds without variation. It does not draw attention. It does not require notice. No tone lingers in the air. No vibration remains along the stone. Any sound that exists fades immediately. The room absorbs what little reaches it. Silence returns without effort. No echo forms. No resonance continues. The quiet remains complete. It fills the room evenly. No corner holds a different sound. No surface reflects noise. The silence remains uniform from wall to wall. It remains uniform from floor to ceiling. No sound passes through the opening. No sound arrives from outside. The quiet remains sealed within the room. It does not break or pause. Silence remains constant without signal. No hum persists. No tone repeats. No rhythm forms. The room does not respond to attention. It remains quiet regardless of notice. The absence of sound remains complete. No detail emerges within the quiet. No sound sharpens or softens. The quiet remains flat and even. It does not carry meaning. It does not suggest movement. It does not suggest time passing. The silence remains passive. It remains unchanged. No interruption appears. No pause signals itself. The quiet holds the room in place. The room holds the quiet in return. They remain together without interaction. No sound travels across the space. No noise accumulates. The quiet remains complete and unbroken. It does not vary by location. It does not vary by moment. No background sound persists. No foreground sound appears. The silence remains consistent. It does not suggest expectation. It does not suggest waiting. No sound resolves or concludes. No sound begins. The quiet remains settled within the room. It remains unchanged within the monastery walls. No sound presses inward. No sound escapes outward. The silence remains contained and even. It does not expand or contract. The absence of sound remains steady. No vibration lingers in the air. No footstep echoes. No voice carries. No distant noise intrudes. The quiet remains uninterrupted. It remains as it is. No change appears within it. The room remains defined by quiet alone. The silence remains present without emphasis. It does not announce itself. It simply remains. The absence of sound continues without signal. No sound marks a moment. No sound marks a boundary. The quiet remains constant and whole. It does not thin or deepen. The silence remains evenly distributed. No sound rises near the light. No sound hides in shadow. The quiet remains everywhere at once. It does not suggest direction. It does not suggest distance. The silence remains neutral and still. No sound interrupts the balance. No sound disturbs the space. The quiet remains exactly as it is. Nothing else is required. Time holds no position within the room. No moment stands apart from another. The space does not mark beginnings or endings. Nothing within the room suggests sequence. The room remains without reference to before or after. No event divides the quiet. No interval announces itself. The space remains present without duration. Nothing signals the passing of time. Nothing suggests waiting or arrival. The room does not hold a clock or measure. No sound or light marks a moment. The candlelight does not count seconds. Shadow does not lengthen or shorten. The stone remains unchanged regardless of moment. The surfaces do not register age or passage. The space remains the same without reference. Nothing in the room points to a prior state. Nothing points ahead. The interior remains suspended from sequence. Time does not gather here. It does not move through the space. It does not settle or drift. The room remains indifferent to duration. No surface changes with passing moments. No shadow indicates progression. The light remains without rhythm. The quiet remains without beat. Nothing repeats to mark time. Nothing varies to suggest passage. The room does not divide itself into moments. It remains whole and undivided. No segment feels earlier or later. The space remains constant regardless of duration. Time does not announce itself here. It does not require attention. The interior remains neutral to sequence. Nothing within the room ages or renews. The stone remains without timeline. The wood remains without measure. The air remains without cycle. The light remains without count. The darkness remains without interval. The room exists without reference to past or future. No trace of time remains visible. No sound implies duration. The quiet does not deepen or thin with passing. Nothing signals a change of moment. The interior remains present only as itself. Time does not accumulate here. It does not move forward or backward. It does not pause or resume. The room remains untouched by chronology. No detail suggests a previous state. No detail suggests a next state. The space remains steady without reference. Time does not pass through the walls. It does not settle on the floor. It does not rest in the air. The room does not measure duration. It does not respond to it. The light does not indicate passage. The shadow does not suggest movement. Nothing changes to mark a moment. The space remains outside of sequence. No sense of earlier or later appears. The interior remains evenly present. Time remains absent of meaning here. It does not apply itself to the room. The room remains indifferent to duration. No feature grows older or newer. The surfaces remain unchanged across moments. The quiet remains unbroken across moments. Nothing accumulates with passing time. Nothing resolves or concludes. The space does not move from one state to another. It remains as it is. Time does not signal itself within the room. It does not leave a trace. The room remains outside of counting. No second follows another. No minute suggests length. No hour suggests scale. The interior remains neutral to duration. Nothing marks the passage of moments. Nothing marks the absence of them. The space remains free of temporal edges. No boundary separates one time from another. The room remains evenly present without change. Time does not enter or leave. It does not remain or depart. The interior remains whole without reference. The room exists without timeline. Nothing within it indicates duration. Nothing within it indicates progress. The space remains constant without measure. Time holds no meaning here. The room remains settled outside of sequence. The interior remains unchanged across moments that do not register. Nothing else is required. The room remains quiet. The space remains still. Light remains present. Darkness remains present. Nothing changes. The room stays as it is. Surfaces remain. Edges remain. Nothing moves. Nothing begins. Nothing ends. The space remains complete. Light stays close. Darkness stays wide. The room remains held. Nothing draws focus. Nothing asks for attention. The space remains even. The quiet remains even. No detail rises. No detail fades. The room remains present. The room remains present. The room remains present. Light remains soft. Shadow remains soft. The space remains unchanged. Nothing signals change. Nothing suggests change. The room remains the same. The space remains the same. The quiet remains the same. Nothing shifts. Nothing varies. The room holds stillness. The stillness holds the room. The space remains flat. The space remains calm. Light remains limited. Darkness remains wide. No edge stands out. No edge recedes. The room remains settled. The space remains settled. The quiet remains settled. Nothing interrupts. Nothing intrudes. The room remains closed. The space remains enclosed. The light remains small. The dark remains large. Nothing sharpens. Nothing dulls. The room remains neutral. The space remains neutral. The quiet remains neutral. No sound appears. No sound remains. The absence remains complete. The room remains unchanged. The room remains unchanged. The room remains unchanged. Light stays near. Dark stays far. The space remains simple. The space remains plain. Nothing complicates it. Nothing explains it. The room remains as it is. No description expands. No description adds. The words remain few. The meaning remains thin. The space remains clear. The space remains empty. Nothing fills it. Nothing leaves it. The room remains quiet. The quiet remains quiet. The space remains space. Light remains light. Dark remains dark. Nothing else appears. Nothing else matters. The room remains present without detail. The space remains present without detail. The quiet remains present without detail. No thought is required. No attention is required. The room remains still. The space remains still. The quiet remains still. Nothing happens. Nothing continues. Nothing changes. The room remains. The space remains. The quiet remains. Light remains. Darkness remains. The room remains as it is. The room remains. The space remains. Light remains. Dark remains. Nothing changes. Nothing begins. Nothing ends. The room holds stillness. Stillness holds the room. The space stays even. Edges soften without moving. Surfaces remain without detail. The shape of the room remains implied. No part stands out. No part recedes. Light exists quietly. Darkness exists quietly. They do not meet. They do not separate. They remain as they are. The room remains without emphasis. The space remains without focus. Nothing asks to be noticed. Nothing asks to be named. Objects remain without importance. Surfaces remain without description. The space holds what is there. It does not add. It does not remove. The quiet remains even. The quiet remains wide. No sound forms. No sound fades. The absence remains complete. The room exists without reference. No past appears. No future appears. The space remains present only as itself. Time holds no meaning here. Duration does not apply. Sequence does not appear. The room remains whole. Nothing divides it. Nothing defines it further. Light remains small. Darkness remains wide. The difference remains quiet. It does not call attention. Surfaces lose distinction. Edges lose clarity. The space remains familiar without detail. Nothing sharpens. Nothing softens further. The room remains settled. The space remains settled. The quiet remains settled. No signal appears. No cue appears. The room does not respond. The space does not react. It simply remains. The language grows thinner. Words carry less weight. Meaning loosens without effort. The room remains without description. The space remains without story. Nothing unfolds. Nothing resolves. The room remains as a place. The place remains as space. The space remains as quiet. Quiet remains as quiet. Light remains as light. Dark remains as dark. No distinction matters. No label persists. The space holds without holding tightly. Nothing presses inward. Nothing pulls away. The room remains neutral. The space remains neutral. The quiet remains neutral. Attention is not required. Focus is not required. The space does not depend on notice. It remains without it. Objects no longer need names. Surfaces no longer need edges. The room remains implied rather than seen. The space remains felt rather than defined. The quiet remains everywhere at once. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing replaces it. The language slows without stopping. Words become fewer. Descriptions thin further. The space remains sufficient. Nothing else is added. Nothing else is needed. The room remains unchanged. The space remains unchanged. The quiet remains unchanged. Light remains unchanged. Dark remains unchanged. Everything remains. Nothing else appears. Nothing else matters. The room remains without edge or center. The space remains without measure. The quiet remains without interruption. Language approaches stillness. Meaning approaches rest. The space remains open and complete. Nothing needs to follow. Nothing needs to come next. The room remains. The space remains. The quiet remains. Light remains. Dark remains. Nothing else is required. The room remains present without effort. The space holds without needing definition. Light remains, though it no longer asks to be described. Darkness remains, wide and unmeasured. The distinction between them stays quiet. Nothing within the room asks for attention. Nothing requires naming. The space remains complete as it is. Surfaces remain without emphasis. Edges remain without insistence. The room does not change its state. It does not move forward or back. The interior remains settled. Stillness continues without interruption. Language begins to loosen its grip. Words carry less weight than before. Descriptions arrive and pass without holding. The room remains regardless of them. The space does not depend on clarity. It remains whole without explanation. Light exists softly without boundary. Dark exists fully without edge. They remain together without contrast. The space does not divide itself. Nothing separates one moment from another. The room holds no sequence. It does not arrange itself into parts. The quiet remains even. It remains wide. Sound does not enter the space. Silence remains without condition. The room exists without reference. No point within it is more important than another. No detail insists on being seen. The space allows attention to rest. It does not hold it tightly. The room remains open to stillness. Stillness remains open within it. The sense of structure begins to soften. Not by removal, but by quieting. The room remains as a place, not a scene. It does not present itself. It simply remains. The space feels less arranged. Not because it has changed, but because nothing asks to be held together. The room remains intact. Meaning rests lightly on the surface of words. It does not sink in. It does not linger. The space remains unaffected by language. Light continues without emphasis. Darkness continues without interruption. The difference between them becomes less important. The room no longer needs contrast. It remains sufficient as it is. The edges of the space feel less distinct. Not because they fade, but because they no longer matter. The room holds its shape without asserting it. The quiet remains uninterrupted. It does not deepen or thin. It simply remains present. The space does not move toward anything. It does not wait. It does not conclude. The room exists outside of arrival, outside of departure. The sense of time grows less relevant. Moments do not stack or separate. The space remains evenly held. No part of it signals importance. No part of it recedes into absence. The room remains neutral to observation. It does not respond to being noticed. The space does not ask to be understood. It remains without explanation. Language continues, but more lightly now. Words drift across the surface of quiet. They do not disturb it. They do not shape it. The room remains the same beneath them. The space remains settled and complete. Nothing unfolds. Nothing resolves. The quiet remains evenly distributed. The room does not hold tension. It does not release tension. It remains outside of effort. The sense of structure continues to thin. Not abruptly, but gently. The room no longer needs to be pictured clearly. It remains without image, without narrative. The space holds what is present without distinction. Light and dark remain, but quietly. The quiet remains whole. Nothing presses inward. Nothing pulls away. The room remains balanced without effort. Language becomes less precise. Not because it fails, but because it is no longer needed. The space remains sufficient on its own. The quiet remains sufficient on its own. The room continues to exist without demand. Nothing needs to follow from this. Nothing needs to come next. The space remains open and complete. The room remains. The space remains. The quiet remains. The room remains without needing to be noticed. The space remains without needing to be held in mind. Light remains without asking to be understood. Dark remains without boundary or edge. The difference between them matters less now. Nothing in the room asks to be followed. Nothing asks to be remembered. The space remains sufficient without detail. Surfaces remain, though they no longer stand apart. Edges remain, though they no longer define. The room does not organize itself. It does not present parts or sections. The interior remains whole without effort. Stillness continues without reference. Language thins further. Words arrive with less weight. They pass more easily. Meaning no longer settles for long. The room remains beneath language. The space remains untouched by it. Light exists quietly, without contrast. Dark exists quietly, without depth. They remain together without distinction. The space no longer divides itself by description. Nothing separates one phrase from another. The sense of sequence continues to soften. Moments no longer stack. The room holds no order. The quiet remains even. It remains wide. Sound does not appear. Silence remains without edge. The space exists without reference to time. Nothing suggests before or after. The room does not change state. It does not arrive anywhere. It does not leave. The space remains open to stillness. Stillness remains open within it. The sense of structure grows faint, not disappearing, but loosening. The room remains without presentation. It does not hold an image. It does not hold a story. The space feels less arranged, less defined, less separate. The room remains intact without being outlined. Meaning touches briefly, then lifts away. It does not settle. It does not gather. The space remains unaffected. Light continues without emphasis. Dark continues without interruption. The difference between them fades in importance. The room no longer needs contrast to be present. Edges feel less distinct. Not because they move, but because they are no longer needed. The room holds itself without asserting shape. The quiet remains uninterrupted. It does not deepen or thin. It simply remains. The space does not move toward anything. It does not wait for continuation. It does not conclude. The sense of time loosens further. Moments lose separation. The space remains evenly held. No part signals importance. No part recedes into absence. The room remains neutral to notice. It does not respond to attention. The space does not ask to be understood. It remains without explanation. Language continues to thin. Words soften as they appear. They leave more space behind them. The room remains beneath them. The space remains settled and complete. Nothing unfolds. Nothing resolves. The quiet remains evenly distributed. The room does not hold tension. It does not release tension. Effort no longer applies. Structure continues to dissolve gently, without collapse, without removal. The room no longer needs to be pictured. It remains without image, without narrative. The space holds what is present without distinction. Light and dark remain quietly. The quiet remains whole. Nothing presses inward. Nothing pulls away. The room remains balanced without effort. Language grows simpler, less precise, less necessary. The space remains sufficient on its own. The quiet remains sufficient on its own. The room continues to exist without demand. Nothing needs to follow from this. Nothing needs to come next. The space remains open and complete. Words continue to appear and fade. They leave little trace. The room remains unchanged beneath them. The quiet remains intact. The space does not require continuation. It remains as it is. Dissolution continues without notice. Not as loss, as release. The room remains. The space remains. The quiet remains. The room remains. The space remains. Light remains quietly. Dark remains quietly. Nothing asks to be noticed. Nothing asks to be named. The space is enough. The room is enough. Edges no longer matter. Surfaces no longer stand apart. The room does not arrange itself. It does not present anything. Stillness remains. Quiet remains. Words arrive more softly now. They pass more easily. Meaning does not settle. It touches and lifts away. The space remains beneath language, unaffected. Light and dark no longer contrast. They simply are. The room does not divide itself. No parts stand out. No parts recede. The sense of order grows faint. Not gone, just quiet. Time does not apply here. Moments do not separate. Nothing marks before or after. The space remains even. The quiet remains wide. Sound does not appear. Silence does not announce itself. The room exists without reference. No detail asks to be held. No image needs forming. The space feels less defined, less outlined, less separate. The room remains intact without shape. Language grows thinner. Sentences shorten. Pauses widen. The quiet holds between words, and after them, meaning loosens further. It no longer gathers. The space remains untouched. Light remains without emphasis. Dark remains without depth. The difference fades in importance. The room no longer needs contrast. Edges feel optional, not absent, just unnecessary. The room holds itself quietly. The quiet holds everything else. Nothing presses inward. Nothing pulls away. The space does not move. It does not wait. It does not conclude. Time loosens further. Duration fades. Sequence dissolves. The space remains evenly present. No part signals importance. No part disappears. The room remains neutral to notice. It does not respond. The space does not explain itself. It does not need to. Language thins again. Words soften further. Some almost fade. The quiet remains between them and around them. The room remains beneath all of it, unchanged, complete. Nothing unfolds. Nothing resolves. The quiet remains evenly spread. The room does not hold tension. It does not release anything. Effort no longer applies. Structure is barely felt. Not gone. Just distant. The room no longer needs to be pictured. It remains without image, without story. The space holds what is present, without sorting. Light remains, dark remains, quiet remains. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing replaces it. Language approaches silence. Meaning approaches rest. The space remains open, complete. The room remains. The space remains. The quiet remains. The room remains. The space remains. Quiet remains. Light remains. Dark remains. Nothing asks for attention. Nothing asks for meaning. The space is enough. The room is enough. Edges no longer matter. Surfaces no longer separate. Stillness remains. Quiet remains wide. Words arrive softly. They fade quickly. Meaning does not settle. It lifts away. The space remains beneath language, unaffected. Light and dark simply are. No contrast holds. No detail stays. The room does not divide itself. Nothing stands apart. Nothing recedes. Time does not apply. Moments do not separate. The space remains even. The quiet remains even. Sound does not appear. Silence does not announce itself. The room exists without reference. No image forms. No thought is needed. Language grows faint. Pauses grow longer. The quiet holds between words. And after them, meaning loosens further. It does not gather. The space remains untouched. Light remains without emphasis. Dark remains without depth. The difference no longer matters. Edges feel unnecessary. Not gone. Just quiet. The room holds itself. The quiet holds everything else. Nothing presses inward. Nothing pulls away. The space does not move. It does not wait. It does not conclude. Time loosens completely. Sequence fades. Duration fades. The space remains evenly present. No part signals importance. No part disappears. The room remains neutral to notice. It does not respond. The space does not explain itself. It does not need to. Language thins again. Words soften further. Some barely form. The quiet remains between them and around them. The room remains beneath all of it, unchanged, complete. Nothing unfolds, nothing resolves. The quiet remains evenly spread. Effort no longer applies. Structure is no longer felt. Not gone, just absent of need. The room no longer needs to be pictured. It remains without image, without story. The space holds what is present, without sorting. Light remains. Dark remains. Quiet remains. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing replaces it. Language rests. Meaning rests. The space remains open, complete. The room remains. The space remains. The quiet remains.